Okay, so this is part one of chapter 8. After discussing social stratification in chapter 7 and going over the four main stratification systems slavery, caste, and estate, and ending with the class system, this chapter, we are going to focus more specifically on what is social class. How do we measure social class? What are the consequences of social class? With a particular focus on poverty. And then we'll end with a discussion about the future of social class and how that relates to the government's response. So there will be in total 3 parts to this chapter. So, beginning with an introduction to the sixth class typology that your textbook also presents and goes over in detail. So, I won't spend as much time on this because this is actually a part of the textbook that Hensland does offer some really good concrete information about what makes each class type unique. But of these 6 classes, and it's nicely arranged on the ladder for you, so you don't even have to envision the ladder during this particular presentation. You have the capitalist class at the top. And so one thing to note about the capitalist class, it says right there that income-wise that they make more than $1 million a year. Usually they make even more than that. This is a class where instead of relying on income, they might also be relying on wealth and assets, so they don't necessarily have to go to work every day. And you see that under occupation, it says investors and heirs. For education, especially if they are one of the top executives, they probably went to a very prestigious university like an Ivy League. But certainly if you're an heir, right, like the Paris Hiltons of the world, then maybe you didn't even have to go to college at all. But this is a very small percentage of the population. This is like the rough 1% or, top 3%. And this class can be really hard to get into. They tend to marry people of the same class, and even if you plan your career very carefully, unless there is like some technological innovation or invention that you are able to take early advantage of, this is a harder class for people to propel themselves to. And when they do, these are those rare, like rag to riches stories. The next social class is upper middle. This class is almost always kind of 2 key characteristics set it apart. First of all, to be in this class, you not only had to go to college and get a 4-year degree, usually you had to get some type of postgraduate study. And so this class is comprised of upper level managers, but then also the kind of professionals in society: doctors, pharmacists, accountants, dentists, attorneys. All of them are part of the upper middle class. The kind of floor in terms of income for this class is $125,000. And this is about 15% of the population. Part of what separates this class apart, even if they are like a highly compensated doctor who makes over $1 million, is that idea that they do have to work for their money. That no matter how highly compensated they are not living off of their assets. They are not investors or heirs. They are just highly compensated professionals. Who had to earn their position through education and now earn their income through largely day to day work. The next class is lower middle, and this is kind of a hodgepodge mix of a class. First of all, it's the largest of the classes at 34%. At about 60%, or about $60,000, the income is like right above the median average income. And there are a lot of different people that kind of fall under this. You can kind of see that by looking at both the education and the sample occupations. So one way that you can be lower middle class is you go to college, you get a BA, you probably don't get a postgraduate degree, and you have the type of career that with a college education is not necessarily extremely highly compensated. But then We also consider people who are craftspeople, skilled tradesmen. You know, you are a master carpenter or a plumber or HVAC, you own your own business. In this case, even if you make a little bit more money than 60,000, we still usually only put people who fall into that category in lower middle, largely because of that lack of education. The idea that you graduated from high school, you maybe have some type of associate's degree or an apprenticeship. But not a BA. So there are a lot of different pathways into the lower middle class, not necessarily just going to college and getting a BA. The working class normally has no college education. They only have a high school diploma. They make about $36,000 a year, which is lower than the median income in America. This is the second largest of the classes at 30%. These would be people like factory workers, clerical workers, some craftspeople. Uh, and together, the working class and the lower middle class, when a lot of Americans describe themselves as being middle class, when sociologists then take their information and then kind of recategorize them using the sixth system, usually they fall in one of those two classes, the lower middle or the working class. And at 64% of Americans belonging to one of those classes, this is a very sizable chunk of Americans. The final two rungs are the people that we classify as poor. And the distinguishing characteristic between being working poor and underclass has everything to do with that word working. The working poor are people that have jobs, usually full time jobs, but they make just enough money that they are right at or above the poverty line, which we will talk about in the next presentation. So these are minimum wage jobs, these are day laborers, these are service workers. This is about 15% of the population. And then finally, we have the underclass, and these are people who either do not work or they only work part time. They perhaps are living on government assistance, and they are predominantly below the poverty line. And this isn't the bulk of the poor. At 5%, this is, just a small, this is like 25% of the 20% of Americans, the bottom quintile, if you will. So a lot of people at the bottom um, of the kind of income stratification classification system are people who work. They just work at jobs that are largely lowly paid. So now we're going to kind of break this social class ladder apart by considering going back to Weber's three P's: property, prestige, and power, and how this factors into your placement in this social class system. So beginning with the component of property. Property has two components. One form of property is income, and income is the amount of money a person or household earns in a given period of time or receives. This can be through job salary, but it also can be through the form of like paternity and alimony payments. It can be Social Security disability, which is cash assistance that you receive from the government. But this is the money that comes into your household during a specific period of time. And so we have a couple of graphs that just kind of look at the income distribution in America. So this is just another way of presenting similar information to what I discussed in part one of the stratification chapter. So this just shows that kind of consistently, the bottom fifth, the fourth fifth, the third fifth, the second fifth, the top fifth. So these are our quintiles. You can kind of see that what you have here are people who roughly their experience has stayed the same in regards to how they are classifying their health and how this is related to the amount of income that they have within their household. And so just noting the very small number of people at the bottom who say that they are, doing well in terms of their health versus the much higher number of people at the top. Um, if you look at the highest paid CEOs, and that's why I said that whole 1 million is kind of laughable, because really the highest paid CEOs make a lot more than that. You have Mark Lore from Walmart, Tim Cook from that says Apply, but clearly that should say Apple. John Weinbart from Evercore Partners, Sundar Pichai from Alphabet, and Elon Musk from Tesla. So a lot more than 1 million. That's kind of a very low floor. Um, Bill Gates is oftentimes, he's not on that list because at this point he is like the wealthiest person on the planet at 86 billion. But wealth in the world of sociology is measured differently than the concept of income. And so, what is wealth? Wealth, or what is also called net worth, is the value of everything a person owns minus the value of everything owed. So, what goes in your column? Home equity, quality vehicles, meaning your vehicle does not depreciate over time, but instead appreciates over time. If you watch that TV show with Jerry Seinfeld, Coffee and Cars with Comedians, I think is the name of it. The types of vehicles that he has in his fancy antique car collection would be an example of the type of vehicle that would be considered an asset. My Honda, which depreciated the moment I drove it off the lot, is not going to be considered necessarily an asset. Stocks, bonds, cash, and other forms of investment assets. Wealth can be built up over a lifetime and then is oftentimes passed down to your future generations. And it is a kind of pool of assets that your family can pull from. So while people who maybe make high income are still somewhat limited by the fact that they have to go to work every day, that if they lost their job, if their company went out of business, that might would potentially change their whole income profile. Once you build up enough wealth, this kind of safeguards and protects you from fluctuations in the economic market. And that's largely true of billionaires. So, as we discussed in the stratification chapter, compared to income inequality, America is even more stratified when it comes to wealth inequality. The wealthiest 1% of Americans own 35% of the nation's wealth. The wealthiest 10% of Americans own over 77% of the nation's wealth. And we can determine that by looking at who has majority shares in things like stocks and bonds and businesses and homes. For a lot of Americans, the only thing that they might have in their wealth column is their home, and that's if they own their home outright, right? If it's not been mortgaged and remortgaged, in which case the bank owns their home. So moving on to the second P, which is prestige. So prestige is closely related to occupation, which introduces a set of terms I would like you to know about occupations. So occupations is a person's main vocation or paid employment, their main source of income. And one way we can talk about occupations is describing the color of the collar. Um, if you are a blue collar worker, then you participate in kind of manual labor work. You work with your hands. This is things like construction, plumbing, HVAC, a mechanic. All of those are the types of jobs that we consider to be blue collar work. If you are a white collar worker, you work in an office building. Think about like a button down shirt versus a work shirt. So you usually have a job that requires some type of formal education, and instead of doing manual labor with your hands, you are probably doing some type of analytic skills. Then finally, we have pink collar, and this is the one that students oftentimes are not as familiar with. And that's because a lot of the blue collar work is primarily associated with men. So men who do not go on to college have this opportunity to do these manual labor jobs, which, if you look at the sixth class system, working class jobs, possibly even lower middle class jobs, are not necessarily that lowly compensated. But pink collar jobs are the jobs that are done primarily by women who don't go to college. And these jobs tend to be a little bit more lowly paid because they pay predominantly minimum wage. These are things like waitresses, receptionists, domestics, low paid retail, and we call those pink collar jobs. Now, to go along with occupation, we also have this concept of prestige, which we talked about when we talked about chapter 7. Prestige is the respect and regard that's associated with your associated social position. We measure prestige by asking people what type of prestige do they associate with certain jobs. And we call that prestige scales. And some jobs are higher prestige than others, and some jobs are what we call low prestige jobs. And so the next couple of slides, I literally am just showing you when we collect this data and we ask people to rank jobs on a score from 1 to 100, which jobs do we consider to be more highly prestigious than others? So unsurprisingly, a physician is at the top with 86, but astronauts are also highly ranked, lawyers, college professors, airline pilots. If you go down a little bit and you start getting to the middle of the prestige scale, we have actors and actresses at 58, coaches at 53, electricians at 51. This is normally the part where you start to see the types of jobs that did not necessarily require a college education. There are very few jobs that we rank highly on the prestige scales if they did not involve some form of higher education. And then if we keep going and we get to the very low end of the prestige scale, bartender, 25, bill collectors, 24. I think that probably has a lot more to do about how people feel about paying their bills. Factory workers, 24. Janitors, 22. The point with prestige scales is the idea that in a society where we're all expected to work, that doesn't necessarily mean that all jobs are seen or perceived as being equally the same in terms of status, in terms of admiration, and that people who have jobs that are highly admired, even if they are not necessarily as well compensated, i.e. school teachers, that there is this benefit to that, even if it's not necessarily a direct tangible benefit like making a lot of money. And so this brings us to the final component of social class, which is power. Power is the ability to control others. And so I'm going to give you some information about power that goes beyond chapter 8. If you would like to read a little bit more about this information yourself, you can always turn to chapter 11 on government and economy and read that first part of the chapter. But I think my video here should be sufficient in terms of answering any questions you might have. So another way of thinking about power is to think about it as domination. The idea that you can use your position to get people to obey you. And if people obey you and largely agree that they should be obeying you, then we call that legitimate domination. If people don't really feel like you should have the right to tell them what to do and they resent you, and they only follow along with what you're doing because perhaps you're using force or coercion, we call that illegitimate domination. If you have legitimate domination, this is also referred to as authority. And so there are three types of authorities. There's traditional, legal, rational, and charismatic. Traditional is based on tradition, so the sanctity of age-old rules and powers. So the examples there: tribal chiefs, royalty, monarchy, priest, parents. These are people that, depending on your culture, you've been raised to believe should have the right and the ability to tell you what to do. You are taught to obey them. Legal rational is more of what we have in our society, in our government-based positions, as well as maybe your boss, your professor. And this is the type of authority that comes from laws, right? It's the idea that you obey a person not necessarily because of who they are, their personality, but because you recognize that they have authority over you because of some law or policy. This type of authority is seen as being the most rational, and is seen as being the one that it is best to base governments upon. And the final one is charismatic. This is individual based. There is something about this person, their personality, their ability to connect with people, to talk to people, that makes people want to follow them. These people that have charismatic authority, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. or Hitler or a cult leader or celebrity or social media influencer, the key thing here is about them, the individual. It's not necessarily about their position. So if something happened to that individual, people would not necessarily follow the next person in line because they were really following the person, not the position. And so, going beyond these types of authorities, the other kind of big interest in talking about power is like who has power in the United States. And there are two views on this, the functionalist view and the conflict view. The functionalist view is that we have pluralism in society, and so power is kind of equally shared, and even people who have a little more power than others, they prioritize the group and the needs of the group over kind of their own needs and wants and desires. And pluralism uses checks and balances to prevent any one person from gaining control over the government. The conflict perspective is best encapsulated by the concept of the power elite, which is an idea that was created by C. Wright Mills, who we talked about at the very start of this course, when we were talking about the sociological imagination. And he posits that most of us do not have power in society. So if you're looking at the slide, he was like, the masses of the people are that big purple base of the pyramid. We're unorganized, we're exploited, we're mostly uninterested, we don't have a lot of power. The middle level would be like our elected representatives to Congress, other legislatures, interest group leaders, local opinion leaders. These are people who have a little bit of power. I have students say that ask, would celebrities and social media influencers go there? Yeah. The ones that certainly have power and exert their power and try to use their kind of name to influence people to feel certain ways, they would kind of be in that middle part of the pyramid. And then at the very top of the pyramid, there are three types of people. There are corporate leaders, and these are the executives of like Fortune 400 companies, like really influential CEOs. You have political leaders, and this would be like your top leaders, like your president, vice president, your Senate majority leader, your Senate minority leader, your Supreme Court justices. And then you have the military. And once again, these aren't just your enlisted rank and file soldiers. These are the top military brass. These are the chief of staffs. These are the generals, right? So this is the concept of the power elite. And if you were to read chapter 11, you'll see that, when they weigh in on which view is more accurate, which view better describes what we have right now in society, it is there's overwhelming evidence that kind of points to the wealthy and business groups kind of being a major influence on U.S. policy, both through the money that they donate to political campaigns and the increasing kind of significance and importance of special interest groups, like the AARP, unions, the NRA. So there are certainly people that have a lot more power in our society than most of us. Power, unlike what pluralism suggests, isn't very equally shared. So once again, a person having a lot of power also will kind of place them in the social class ladder, higher up. Now, your book notes that there is one group of people that, especially in today's society, we're all very aware of, and they don't seem to fit perfectly in the typology. And if you guess celebrities, you're absolutely right. Celebrities are unique in the sense that they have money that makes them into a capitalist, and they also have a high level of prestige depending on the celebrity. But because celebrity can be fleeting, right? We hear of celebrities, falling into obscurity, going bankrupt. that's why most sociologists are hesitant to kind of place them in those top classes. And the kind of unearned aspect means that they don't necessarily belong in the upper middle class, where a lot of those people have day to day jobs related to very high levels of education. And the jobs that they have are often kind of associated with higher levels of like status and prestige in terms of people admiring them and looking up for them. So, just know that celebrities kind of are an example of a category that exists outside of all the other categories. The final point that I want to make in presentation one is that people can have what we call status inconsistency. So basically, they rank higher on some dimensions than others in regards to social class. So they might have a lot of money, but they maybe earn that money in an occupation that has very low prestige. So, like, I don't know, maybe an exotic dancer or someone in the kind of adult entertainment industry. Or perhaps they are in a job with a high level of prestige, but really they don't make a lot of money. So, it's worth noting in North Carolina, where I think like the average starting teacher pay is like $28,000, $30,000. That's not even lower middle class money. That's like working class money. But we often say that teachers are a well respected profession, that they enjoy a certain level of prestige. So, one way that we like to study, how do people respond when they kind of live this life of status inconsistency? One group that we can study to kind of make sense of that are people that win the lottery, right? Because basically overnight, their property dramatically increases, but they largely have been socialized in a very different social class background. And they rarely, when they enter into that kind of higher social class on the basis of property, they don't necessarily receive the prestige that comes with having that much property. And this has both concrete as well as social psychological impacts on them. So that is it for this first presentation. In the second presentation, I'm going to be talking about the consequences of social class, kind of the impact of social class, as well as specifically one social class in particular, the impoverished.